Welcome, everybody. I'm David Lair. On behalf of Community Advocates and Jews United for Democracy and Justice, it's a pleasure to welcome you to America at a Crossroads. We endeavor to, on our 2-year weekly effort, we endeavor to bring the most thoughtful and insightful thinkers to you. Preliminarily, a bit of housekeeping. Tonight, there is a link in the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen where you can subscribe to the notices we send out of upcoming programs. If you aren't already on our list, this is an easy way to sign up. Just click on the link and complete the brief form. You've seen our co-sponsors on the screen for the past few minutes. We are indebted to them all. Tonight, I'm standing in for my partner, Janice Kaminer-Resnick, who usually welcomes you, but I also speak on behalf of the executive committee made up of Janice, Mel Levine, Zev Yaroslavsky, Rabbi Ken Chasen, and Caroline Kelly. Next week, we welcome the former acting Solicitor General of the United States, Neil Katyal. He's argued dozens of cases before the United States Supreme Court and is a frequently quoted maven on all matters legal. He will be joined by the Washington Post's Pulitzer Prize-winning national investigative reporter and best-selling author, Carol Leonig. Madeline Brand of KCRW will moderate. The following week, May 4th, we'll have one of our most popular guests back, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen. He'll offer an expert's view of a topsy-turvy world in dialogue with our returning host of tonight, Warren Olney. Later in May, we will have the second part of our analysis of a topsy-turvy world with the former Secretary of Defense and former head of the CIA, Leon Panetta. These are programs you won't want to miss. And now to introduce this evening's guest and our moderator, my friend and colleague in this effort, a former LA County supervisor and city councilman, and now professor at UCLA, an unparalleled pillar of Los Angeles civic community for the past 4.5 decades, Zev Yaroslavsky. Zev?
Thank you, David. I've never been called a pillar before, but I'll take that as a compliment. I'm speaking to you for the first time in 2 years from the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs, and I'm happy to be here. And behind me is a picture of the Maidan in Kiev during the Orange Revolution, the December 26th election, which I was privileged to observe some 18 years ago. Tonight, we have the privilege of hearing from an expert in his field who is also a very brave man, a hero. Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vindman stands out in today's America as a singular hero. He's one of those rare individuals who exhibited courage in the face of tyranny and wrongdoing, and then faced the consequences. As countless politicians cowered when confronted by the former president's threats, our speaker stood firm, knowing full well that his career was in jeopardy. He was born in Kiev, Ukraine in 1974 and immigrated with his father and twin brother to the United States in 1979. After joining the ROTC in college, he began his military career in 1999 and served in Germany, South Korea, and in combat in Iraq, receiving a Purple Heart. He became a foreign area officer serving in Kiev and Moscow, eventually becoming a Russia specialist, advising the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. His expertise led to his appointment to the National Security Council in the White House. What transpired with the infamous perfect phone call between Trump and President Zelensky, and Alex's role is now legend. We are privileged to and honored to have him back with us at this most propitious time in Russia's war against Ukraine. And to lead the conversation with Alex tonight, we are also privileged to have Warren Olney back with us. Warren is a legend, in his case, a legend in broadcast journalism, nationally and in Southern California. He is a recipient of many Golden Mike Awards, Journalist of the Year, and some 40 other awards for journalistic excellence. He has been a frequent moderator of these America at a Crossroads programs. So Warren, I turn it over to you.
Zev, thank you very much, and welcome to the audience and the conversation we're going to have about how Russia's war has changed the world order. And don't forget that you can submit your questions to David, and he will send them to me, and I'll ask them starting in 40 minutes or so, something like that. In the meantime, Colonel Vindman, it's wonderful to be on the air with you, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to ask you some questions. And I think Zev's remarks very much reflect my own feelings about the evening. So thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Warren. I'm glad to meet you and be on together with you, and then of course to Zev and David and JUDJ for having me back.
Let me start out with that infamous phone call that you were on, that you testified about at the first Trump impeachment. What role do you think it played in Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine?
I think the entire Ukraine scandal, that phone call by itself unleashed a series of events that resulted in the impeachment of President Trump, that showed that, our national security interests in Ukraine could easily fall victim to domestic politics. That actually, in my opening statement, I remember explicitly saying how one political party or the other would perceive injury from the events of that phone call and weaken Ukraine, weaken the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine, and indicate some opportunities for Putin to make some trouble, including the opportunities to wage war. And in fact, I think my worst fears have come to pass. Russia did see a great deal of opportunity in the corruption of the Trump administration around that phone call, but more importantly, the toxicity of those events, how they made Ukraine radioactive, really diluted the kinds of activities that the Zelensky administration could do with the Trump administration for the remainder of that administration, and frankly depressed the interactions between the Biden administration and Ukraine, because again, there was baggage associated with it. The fact that Hunter Biden's involvement with Ukraine became a hot button issue, even though there was an enormous amount of fabrication of corruption on the Biden side of the equation, didn't exist. It still made the issue toxic to the point where the Biden administration didn't really engage with President Zelensky until the summer of 2021. So I think all of this kind of created the ferment, the opportunity for Putin to see that this was a vulnerability. This was the time to strike. The U.S. was not going to be resolved in support of Ukraine, that he could count on President Trump and the Republican Party that was captured by President Trump to be, I think from his perspective, either complicit or certainly look the other way in the face of Russian aggression, that Putin wouldn't have to fear significant costs as a result of this war. So I think this is absolutely apparent to me, that the president and his demand for investigation in exchange for weapons, the hold on security assistance to the war, there's a clear logical thread that this was the fertile ground that set the conditions for this war. And to put a point on this, we should also remember that within hours of this war starting, and even in the hours after this war started, you still had President Trump cheerleading for Putin, talking about how brilliant he was. Tucker Carlson constantly saying, that it's the Russians are the friends, the Ukrainians are the enemy. Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, saying the same thing. So, I mean, all that really did suggest, it's almost like, Putin wandered into a trap. Of course, that's not the case, but he wandered into a trap believing that the cost would be low for this operation. But the American people didn't tolerate that. The American people rallied against Russian aggression. The American people, as well as the European citizens, rallied around Ukraine against Russian aggression, and that's kind of the conditions, I think, set in motion by that phone call and that corrupt enterprise in 2019.
A couple of weeks ago, you told the Washington Post that the war in Ukraine is a personal failure for you. What did you mean by that? Why is that so?
Well, I mean, I referenced the fact that in my testimony in 2019, I had fears about the coming confrontation with Russia. I mean, that was certainly part of my efforts in the Pentagon and the White House to attempt to set the conditions to warn off Russian aggression. I tried to do that through the military plans and strategies that we laid to kind of warn off the fact that Russian aggression against the democratic world would come at a high cost. and I did I did the best I could. Wasn't really successful there. In fact, some people even go so far as to blame me for exposing the presidential corruption and potentially exposing Ukraine to a weakness. The problem is that this was all going to come out. In my view, this was all going to come out in the end. It's hard to keep secrets in government, and if President Trump was successful in his enterprise, he would have burned bridges with the other party, for that matter. And I think President Trump was also very astute at understanding and exposing vulnerabilities and continuing to apply pressure. So I think that would have worked out to everybody's detriment. And we could have stumbled into a situation where, if this corrupt enterprise came to fruition, President Biden would have been harmed, and President Biden would have potentially not been viable. We could have ended up with a Trump term. So I kind of take, I guess, a mixed bag view. I wasn't able to warn off this situation. I was able to protect U.S. interests in the run up in this previous months to this war. I probably sounded a bit like a madman. I started talking about in November about the fact that this war is coming. I wrote a pretty firm piece in New York Times in the beginning of December saying that we should do everything we can to try to avoid this war. And even then, I don't think we could avoid it. We had traveled down the road towards confrontation too far, too many opportunities as far as Putin was concerned for him to pass up on this, what he thought was a critical moment to resecure Ukraine. So I failed to do that too. I failed to kind of warn the government about the steps that we needed to do a really full court press to avoid this war. And now I'm trying to not, kind of strike out, I guess. Now I'm trying to get the U.S. government to realize the dangers around this war and its continuation, a long war scenario, and do more to avoid a long war scenario that actually does directly implicate U.S. security beyond, the economic and political and informational that's already going on. This Cold War prevent us from stumbling into a hot war by doing too little. I don't think it's that we do too little to help Ukraine, that we do too little to warn off Russian aggression. That's how this turns into a protracted war, and that's how the West gets drawn into this. We already see those indications bubbling up. So now I'm trying to not fail in my responsibility as somebody that's worked on this problem for a long time to try to get this administration to be a little bit more thoughtful, think about medium and long-term risks, not just the short-term risks. And that's where I'm focusing my efforts on.
You've been a lot tougher than that. You have said that you don't think that the Biden administration is leading, that we're behind Europe, we're behind Ukraine, of course, and that we need to do more. How much more do we need to do?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you get that I guess that previous question set the scene setter. Why I feel it's absolutely necessary to get us to not stumble from a Cold War into a hot war. That's really what's at play. I mean, that's one acute danger. The other acute danger is, frankly, that this is the first major battle in the direction of the 21st century. If Russia wins, it sets a template for other powers, regional and great powers, to attempt to use their might to attack their neighbors. The rules of the jungle, might makes right. That's what we were fighting for. If Ukraine holds out, it sets back the agenda for the authoritarian world. They have to question their capabilities. They have to question how the second most powerful military in the world broke itself on a democracy. But with regards to the Biden administration, frankly, it's a tough needle to thread. I support this president. This president needs to carry us through the remainder of his term and potentially into a second term, because there's only really, as far as I'm concerned, there's only one viable party right now. There's only one kind of pro-democracy party. It's the Democratic Party. The Republican Party has been captured. So I feel it absolutely essential to help this administration navigate a very, very difficult situation and avoid another Afghanistan, or avoid some sort of failure that undoes the Democratic Party in the midterms or the 2024 elections. At the same time, I feel it's absolutely necessary I guess, to continue to speak truth to power and offer constructive criticism, do the things that I was trying to do behind the scenes directly to my White House, my White House colleagues, to little avail. Now I feel like I have to do it publicly because they were not responding to that, and their respond. Other people could do that part of enticing them or kind of coaxing them. I guess I feel like it's my duty at this point to offer a little bit of constructive criticism to get them to move in the right direction. I think between those other folks and myself, we're slowly, I could see it unwinding. We're slowly helping them kind of come around to some good decisions. Too slow for my comfort level, but they are moving in that direction.
Russia announced today that it has been testing an intercontinental ballistic missile, one that it hasn't developed entirely yet, but President Putin says it can fly at hypersonic speeds, and that all of Russia's enemies should think twice about Russia in that context. President Biden has taken seriously what appears to be a threat of using nuclear weapons by Vladimir Putin. You have not taken it seriously in the past. Does this make you take it more seriously?
Yeah, I would. I contend that I do take it seriously. I take it very seriously, and as a matter of fact, what I've said is that we shouldn't be dismissive of the saber rattling or the threats, and we should take the appropriate posture. But we should not succumb to our fears. It should not be a base primal fear that automatically sees a spiral or an escalation towards nuclear war, because that's illogical. It doesn't make sense. And we can have the separate conversation on logic and what kind of role that has on Vladimir Putin. But there are fundamental principles like mutually assured destruction that hold. There is no way that Putin believes that he could win a nuclear war. And the only way that nuclear weapons get used is in case of an existential threat. An existential threat meaning a strike by the U.S. or the perceptions of an imminent strike by the U.S. that are country and world ending. That's when both sides use nuclear weapons. It's not willy-nilly based on even serious defeats on the battlefield. That's not Russian doctrine, and that doesn't overcome the near insurmountable threshold for the employment of nuclear weapons, which is, how do you survive mutually assured destruction? You can't. So I don't dismiss it. I think we should be taking the appropriate posture. We should be signaling to Russia that we have first strike capabilities. We have second strike capabilities, which means that we could survive a Russian first strike, and that the doctrine of mutually assured destruction is ironclad. And that's how we warn off, just kind of simple saber rattling. And then we take Putin's signaling for what it is. It's to get us to react kind of to a primal instinct, a fight or flight reaction. Of course, in this case, they're not trying to drive a fight; they're trying to drive a flight reaction. And we cannot be held to nuclear blackmail. We're not going to be hostage to that. Otherwise, that would paralyze all of our policies with regards to other nuclear adversaries. And it probably would, last thing, it probably would also kind of take the other folks that are other countries like Iran that are considering nuclear weapons and inspire them to achieve nuclear breakout. That's the recipe for disaster right there.
Well, President Biden has as I said, indicated that he doesn't want to establish a no-fly zone, as President Zelensky has asked him to do, because he fears that would be a direct confrontation with with Russia, excuse me, and that nuclear war might result. Should we then, do you feel, establish the no-fly zone? Should we go ahead? Should we give Zelensky everything he wants?
Yep. So giving Zelensky everything he wants absolutely is different than establishing a no-fly zone, I guess, in my mind. Let me, I guess, parse that out a little bit.
Well, he includes that in his.
Yeah, let me parse that out, because giving him everything he wants, like supporting him with military material, we should absolutely do that. Ukraine is actually capable of establishing its own no-fly zone without, yes, he wants NATO aircraft establishing a no-fly zone, but if we give him the equipment that he needs, advanced air defense system, medium and high altitude air defense system, we give them a long-range strike capabilities like advanced unmanned aerial vehicles, they could pretty much establish their own no-fly zone. Right now, it's not quite a no-fly zone, but let's say let's make it clear that the Russians don't feel like they can fly freely in much of Ukraine because they could get shot down by Ukrainian air defense or Ukrainian aircraft. That's just the reality of the situation. So we need to give them the push to be able to do that themselves. Now, I do have to say, from an intellectual standpoint, and I've strayed away from I actually don't really feel it's appropriate to criticize the people that do call for a no-fly zone on the basis of the fact that I don't think it triggers nuclear war. But I don't think it's necessary either. I think we just arm the Ukrainians with what they need. The reason I say that it doesn't precipitate nuclear wars, again, the threshold is nearly impossibly high, especially now. In the early days, when it looked like Russia was going to defeat Ukraine, I mean, according to a lot of analysts, when it looked like Russia might defeat Ukraine, at that point in time, the theory was, Russia might have the wherewithal, the military means to then strike out at NATO because it had the strength. Now it's really quite weak. Now it doesn't have the means to necessarily to achieve its military aims with regards to Ukraine. The notion that it would be provocative or have the appetite to strike out at NATO, fire on NATO forces, seems preposterous, because there's another doctrine called the right to self-defense, and I've seen this play out on the battlefields in Syria. I've been party to the conversations between the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the chairman of the General Staff. The Russians understand that we will defend ourselves if attacked. So the onus would be on the Russians to then try to knock out our fighters if we decided to establish a no-fly zone. And that itself is an enormously high bar. So I kind of diluted my point a little bit because I went to defend the no-fly zone as people advocate for it. I don't think it's what I'm indicating is that the threshold for nuclear is really high. The threshold for conventional war is really high, but we don't even have to go that. We go to the next level down, which is arming Ukraine, which is really not a high threshold at all. And we're too slowly moving in that direction.
What do you think is the real plan for Ukraine and the strategy and the goal, I should say, of President Zelensky, other than driving the Russians out? If he got what he needs or what he wants, would he go further? Would he attack Russia?
So I think that it's clear to me that the Ukrainians are going to do whatever it takes to defend themselves in the short term, which means that they necessarily have to go after operational targets.
They have to go on the offense.
Offensive, but that's the offensive means that you're not just going after the Russian equipment that's on Ukrainian territory. You're also going after the bases adjacent to Ukrainian territory. I think the notion that Ukraine should fight with its arms tied behind its back for some reason is very strange to me. The biggest advantage that Russia has is in long-range fires. Long-range fires are these ballistic missiles that cruise in from the Russian side of the territory. They're the fighters and fighter bombers that are based in airfields in Ukraine, in Crimean Ukraine, in the Crimean Peninsula, and in the western and southern military districts in Russia. Ukraine must go after those targets. They've actually done that a couple of times. You've seen those operational strikes by helicopters on fuel depots. The Ukrainians have fired these short-range ballistic missiles, these Torchka systems, to limited effect against two different bases. It's not really well covered, but they have done that. The bottom line is that those are completely valid targets that Ukraine needs to go after to end Russia's ability to prosecute the war. Because I fear there's a scenario in which Russia breaks itself on the Ukrainian military, the ground forces, but to avoid a loss, Vladimir Putin continues to rain fire down on Ukrainian cities with bombs and with aerial strikes, with these cruise missile strikes, and that's ultimately what the Ukrainians need to degrade to get this war to come to an end. Otherwise, it could go on for months. And then in that case, you do have the risk of Ukrainian forces crossing into Russian territory on the ground instead of just doing long range strikes. That's when the risk probably becomes higher.
So it becomes higher. Is it worth taking nonetheless?
Well, this is part of the theory that's arresting the administrations, and like I support President Biden. I guess my targets are lower than him. I go after because I know that Jake Sullivan is a break on some of this policy. This is not just me speculating. This is well informed, considered, that he is the one that's kind of arresting more thoughtful aid to Ukraine on misplaced notions of risk. But I guess part of the
Remind our listeners, what job does Jake Sullivan have?
Oh, he's a national security advisor.
Right.
So he's the one everything flows through the White House, the National Security Council coordinates policy. So he played a role in arresting the transfer of those MiG-29s early in the war. Still, I think it plays a role of not being pretty risk averse about providing advanced capabilities to Ukraine, on the notion that if Russia loses too much, if Ukraine wins too much, that this destabilizes Russia and Russia starts to unwind. This balkanization scenario. And this is why I find this particular theory so interesting is that it really resonates with me. I'm working on my doctorate at Johns Hopkins. I'm looking at U.S. foreign policy towards Russia and Ukraine since 1991, and it's clear to me. I already wrote the chapter in the 90s. It's absolutely clear to me that what drove the hyper focus on supporting the Kremlin, supporting first Mikhail Gorbachev to preserve the Soviet Union, and then Kremlin power, was this notion that we could not afford to have a failed state in Russia, failed state that unwinds, and then there are loose nukes or things of that nature. And that is really the same fears that are kind of in a way driving this administration, them to not let Russia lose too badly because of the fact that it could mean an end to Vladimir Putin and his regime, when that's exactly probably what would add some stability to the region. So a actor that's capable of managing only his internal affairs and not strike out at neighbors. I think that would be a much better scenario. So I find that particularly troubling, that you have this scenario. Don't let the Ukrainians get too much capability. And there's also a political science theory that if both sides feel vulnerable, that's the mixture for negotiations. In fact, that's not the way Vladimir Putin would think. If Vladimir Putin were successful in this Eastern campaign, that's not the end of it. He would continue to push, and eventually we could find ourselves back to Ukraine being besieged. That's why this premise of just metering in limited amounts of equipment just in time, to me, is a recipe for disaster and protracted war.
When you were with the National Security Council yourself, you were in Kyiv and you were in Moscow. Did you were you ever in the same room with Vladimir Putin? And if so, what's your reaction to him? If not, what did you hear about him in terms of what he was like to deal with, and how people, his immediate associates, felt about him?
Yeah. So I've never met him, at least not in anything but a large venue. Yeah. So, I didn't shake his hand or anything like that. Yeah. There were larger venues at which, he happened to be, within shouting distance or something of that nature. But I did work, I was the Russia director. So, and Fiona Hill, my boss, interacted with him. And I was privy to all of the kind of intelligence briefings, with a single degree of separation. And this is an area that I've covered for a long time. So I don't know, does it really take looking eye to eye to the man in order to understand him? Possibly there's something to be said about that. But he's very, very well rehearsed and guarded in these formal settings anyway. I mean, you really, to understand him, you gotta have to Texas and sit him down by a fire and look into his eyes and see that he has a soul or something of that nature. But so not too many people get a chance to do that. But
President George Bush did.
So yeah. So I guess in my study of the man, he's quite he's quite sensible. He made major miscalculations in this particular scenario. But if you look at his 22-year reign, you'll see a kind of a steady pattern. It's almost, you could visualize this on a graph. You see the anti-democratic activities in the early 2000s, whether that's attacking business interests to undo an oligarchy. You see the war in Chechnya. You see the forays into the near abroad with regards to the attempts to orchestrate his candidate that resulted in the Orange Revolution, Georgia War, Ukraine war in 2014, but you also have interspersed in there assassination attempts against enemies with nuclear grade materials or chemical grade materials, or people being killed in the streets in Berlin or something of that nature. Bounties on U.S. soldiers. You see this kind of arc, and then of course the biggest one, one of the biggest ones, is interference in the 2016 elections. You see this kind of arc of increasingly provocative behaviors that didn't really result in significant backlashes. You see basically, certainly in the 2000s, a lot of looking the other way with the undemocratic movement, because we had some keen aspirations for the relationship with Russia. We wanted them to be a partner. So those were playing on our hopes. And then we had some fears about another Cold War. So and Vladimir Putin is pretty sharp. He's a KGB case officer. He knows how to, he went to kind of the basics, prey on hopes and fears. And he fed on those and allowed him to get away with all sorts of nefarious dealings. So he was well considered in thinking that he could get away with this one. In his mind, he failed to understand who the Ukrainian people were, that they were going to fight for their independence, that they were accustomed to freedom, and they were not going to be the subject of Vladimir Putin. He also failed to understand that although seemingly the U.S. was polarized, that the spirit of the American people was behind this population fighting for their freedoms, fighting for their homes, fighting for democracy, and that's galvanized the American public. He's failed to see that while we squabble amongst the democratic world, within NATO on smaller issues, we were always going to unite around bigger issues. And he made but he had this. So you had this like expectation on the one hand that he could get away with it, based on this arc of aggression, and on the other hand, this major miscalculation about who the West was, who Ukraine was, and that's going to be his ultimate undoing. But I think he comes across as quite rational. Now he's grabbed the tiger by the tail, and he's trying to figure out how to score a win to preserve his regime. The most emotional I've seen him, frankly, were in the ramp ups to this confrontation. When he's briefing the military in late December, middle to late December, he's like, it was like a screed. He was just really deeply emotional about why this war needed to occur. That's probably about as emotional as the guy kind of gets, that and justifying his actions now. But I think going forward, that's a slightly tougher question. What does he do when he's further isolated, when he starts to feel the pressure of sanctions, when he starts to feel the pressure of people coming back in body bags? That's the kind of the tougher area. So I'm trying to see if I make sure I understood the question. The bottom line is that
to what extent is he in any kind of trouble as a result of things not going well in Ukraine? And
Sure.
You said something about his ultimate undoing. What I want to know is what it's going to take to bring that about.
Yeah, so I think that he's not feeling, he's feeling some strain, but he also has a really tight control on the Russian state. Over the course of the past several years, over the course of the past decade, but certainly over the course of the past year and change, he's really ratcheted down on opposition, and to the point where it is a security state that the Russian people haven't experienced since kind of the early parts of the Cold War, post World War II era. I don't know if I'd quite say it's Stalinist yet, but it's close. It's pretty, we're on the cusp of like large gulags or for political opponents. They've imprisoned thousands and thousands of people. They're not going to be able to sustain that in the prison system. They're going to have to build some other camps. So so he has some control over his population, but when it starts to get really difficult for him is when there's a press from socioeconomic protests, and those are the result of, you know, hyperinflation, the inability to provide for basic needs. Forget about the creature comforts of the middle class, but the inability to provide basic needs. And at the same time, his security apparatus is starting to feel the pinch with regards to not in part not getting the benefits that they've been accustomed to, all the graft and all the, you know, the not, you get pay and then you get your benefits for the security apparatus. But when these things start to come to bear, that's a lot of pressure. He's also not feeling a lot of pressure from right now, it's still been a war that's lasted less than 60 days. And although Russia has suffered massive casualties, 20,000 Russian dead, and then you know, multiply that by 2 or more when you look at casualties, that is a enormous amount of casualties. When the news of this failure starts to kind of percolate, those are going to be forces that he's going to have to reckon with. And I think what that could probably mean is some additional pressure to try to throw everything he's got the kitchen sink at Ukraine, but with the recognition that the Russians are just going to run out of combat power. These ground force units, they're burning through their most storied formations, the airborne forces, their tank armies, these are the troops that they paraded on Victory Day. They're running out of those. So eventually Putin just runs out of the military force to achieve this. And that's where you start to creep in some risks of chemical weapons use, or maybe nuclear weapons use, again, not against NATO, but against Ukraine. And I think President Zelensky spoke about this point pretty articulately, but you know, they're not going to give up their sovereignty. They'll have clearer indications than we will to a certain extent about whether Russia is on the threshold of doing something like that. But that's, the longer this war goes, the closer we get to this scenario. If Ukraine is actually successful in these next 2.5 weeks, next 2.5-3 weeks, right around till Victory Day, I think you have a scenario in which Putin may very well, you know, wash his hands of the situation, say that he's denazified and demilitarized Ukraine by destroying all of Ukraine's cities, and throw a parade for his troops, saying that they won. That would be the optimal outcome. That he could do that. He's a dictator. He could say that he's achieved his military objectives and leave. The worst case scenario is if he's successful, and then he continues to press his advantage into a long war, a grinding war that's going to be grinding on Ukraine, but also grinding on Russia. And that's when he starts to experiment with these other much more dangerous capabilities that also have the legitimate possibility of drawing in NATO. Because right now we have this strategic ambiguity doctrine, where if Russia were to go employ weapons of mass destruction, President Biden said that would be a game changer. He didn't draw it out as a red line. He left it ambiguous, but that's a policy in itself. Actually, it's the same policy we have with regards to China attacking Taiwan. It's a kind of this notion of, we're not going to say what we're going to do, but the risk of a confrontation is relatively high, and that is what kind of warns off Putin's escalation to weapons of mass destruction.
I want to go to our questions from listeners, and we've got some good ones already, but let me, before we do that, ask you one more thing that I've been concerned about. I'm sure everybody else has as well, and that is, what about this extraordinary brutality that we're seeing, not just with missiles destroying entire cities, but with the individual soldiers committing atrocities of a really almost indescribable kind, particularly in Bucha, and then being awarded and recognized by Putin as heroes.
Yeah.
Is this acceptable in Russian society? Is this something that is a characteristic of that country, or is it all about Vladimir Putin?
I don't think we should be dismissive and say it's all about Vladimir Putin. I think there is something to be said about the Russian way of war. Russian and Soviet troops were notoriously brutal in their liberation of Europe from Nazi Germany. I mean, everything, it wasn't just the rape of Berlin. They basically raped and pillaged their way across Europe in the counterattacks. That is not an ancient history either. The Russians were enormously brutal in the Chechen wars. They were brutal in Syria. And if anybody was paying attention to the way Russia conducted its war, this is standard fare. I wrote about this when I wrote my piece. I think it was in Foreign Affairs. I talked about something called morale targets.
Yeah.
The fact that Russia would go after morale targets to break the will of the population to resist. It is a kind of a central notion that the civilian population supports the military campaign, supports the war effort. And if you break the will of the population, you break the military also. So to me, this is unfortunately not a surprise. And the fact that, the 90% of the casualties are falling on the civilian population. It's the Russian army. This is the way the Russian army fights. We are deeply concerned about what we call collateral damage, where we do what we can to avoid it. The Russians are not surgical. They go after hospitals. They go after churches. They as they did it, go after mosques in Syria. They go after schools. These are all legitimate targets to break the population.
A couple of people have asked about the comments by Tucker Carlson that Ukraine is just as corrupt as Russia, and certainly not any better. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, that's a preposterous false equivalency by Tucker Carlson. I mean, I could understand. Look, Tucker Carlson is an entertainer. He's not a news anchor. He doesn't look at the facts. He doesn't look at the details. He just weaves a story. He just weaves a narrative. I mean, and I'm not making this up. When he defended himself against litigation, he said he actually explicitly says, I'm not a news show. I'm an entertainment show. So that's the way he'll say whatever he needs to. It doesn't have to be substantiated in fact. We shouldn't at the same time completely dismiss the fact that there's a story of corruption around Ukraine that kept it vulnerable for it. If it had progressed the way Poland did, it would have worked its way. It would have grown its way out of being vulnerable to Russian attack. It didn't. The history of the first 15 years of Ukraine's post-Soviet existence was a history of a growing oligarchy and communist nomenclature kind of seizing assets. And really, it's not until the mid 2000s and with unfortunately too little progress under the Yanukovych, the Yushchenko administration from 2005 to 2010, they didn't make enough progress. But it's a different country after 2014 than it was before. And over the course of the previous 8 years, they have made major strides. Do they have a long way to go? Yes, but it's absolutely a false equivalency between Russia and Ukraine. And I think you could see that play out in the military, right? Part of the story of Russia's absolute failure in this war is that the Russian military was disastrously corrupt, where things were breaking down, the military was under-equipped. And, I guess, anecdotally speaking, the Ukrainian military has performed fabulously. And that's because it's not the same country. It's not the same military. It's not like, two similar tracks, parallel tracks between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine has made huge strides towards democracy, reform, and anti-corruption efforts. And it's something that they have some work to do, but it's not anywhere near the same thing.
Harry is asking about the Budapest memorandum, and he knows more about it than I do, because he says that when Ukraine gave up its own nuclear weapons, there was apparently in the Budapest memorandum something about coming to the aid of Ukraine if in fact they were threatened with nuclear weapons. What about that? Isn't that an excuse for the United States and for President Biden to say that they're not really concerned about going all out?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. This was you could put this on the shoulders of the Obama administration and the Trump administration as well. I mean, I talk about this long thread of failed policy towards Russia. I think every administration since George W. Bush has complicity in how we ended up here. But on the Biden administration, I mean, on the Budapest memorandum or the Budapest Accords, the U.S. was not interested in providing security guarantees like NATO Article 5 security guarantees to Ukraine on the risk of having to go to war with Russia over a scenario where Russia attacks. So we provided security assurances. These are security assurances that carried over from other kind of documents, like non-proliferation treaty or the OSCE treaties and stuff like that. So we were diplomatically crafty in avoiding providing Ukraine with security guarantees that would have bound us in a way to support Ukraine when it's attacked by Russia. But we did have some sort of moral obligations to at least conduct some sort of consultations, be part of the process. You have the Minsk dialogues unfold in 2015, 14 and 15 to help negotiate at the end to the war when it started back then in the East in the Donbass. And the US decided that it wasn't going to play a role in that, where frankly, under the Budapest Accords, we probably had we should have played a much more critical role because we, the UK, were also signatories to those protocols as well as Russia and Ukraine, and we should have been central to that process.
Howard wants to know, and I think everybody else does too, what to your knowledge was the substance of the off-the-record Trump-Putin conversation in Helsinki?
It's funny. I mean, to me, that was my very, very first day. I showed up on the 16th, July 16th. That was my very first day on the job when all that unfolded, and I had to do like the crisis response in the White House while everybody else was the rest of my team was forward, like Fiona was forward conducting those meetings. And look, I don't have deep concerns about this. These are good people that are parties, like even the translator, somebody I had a relationship with, somebody that wouldn't be complicit in like criminal misdeeds or something of that nature, wouldn't be complicit in the president, like, passing secrets or doing something corrupt. So I don't have those kinds of deep concerns about the Helsinki.
Weren't they all alone though? Weren't they all alone? And didn't the translator destroy the notes?
Well, it was Trump that destroyed the notes, but
okay.
he had his translator there, the U.S. State Department translator. So while I think Fiona's actually said something on this account, and she was there. She was joking about like feigning a fainting spell at one point, to end that press conference, where President Trump just put his foot in his mouth.
But the question is, what happened when they were behind the doors together?
That's right. But like I said, there were other people. There was a translator in the room, a U.S. translator that was in the room. And Fiona's not concerned. And if she's not concerned, I'm not concerned.
Okay. Michelle wants to know, have we given Ukraine the Iron Dome defense?
No. This is, I've made it a point to make myself accessible to Israeli media, newspapers, publications, because I think, frankly, this is the Israeli leadership right now is failing to live up to our Jewish values and our Jewish ethic, and never again. And they're sitting on the sidelines as Putin wishes to unfold a genocide of the Ukrainian population. This is not like, these are not empty words. When you use the word genocide, it's a very, very loaded term. Putin doesn't believe that the Ukrainian people are separate people. He just thinks that they have funny accents, that the Ukrainian nation has the right to exist. So if he had his way, and if you listen to the state media talk about this issue, they do want to destroy the Ukrainian identity. And that, I think, is, so we could play a role in avoiding a genocide And I think Ukraine is doing an amazing job of defending itself right now, no question about it. But they could use some help, and they could use some help from, the Jewish president of Ukraine has asked for help from Israel, and Israel is decided to cater to a short-term need, which is the ability to conduct operations in Syria, have the ability to conduct operations in Iran if they need to, with overflights into Syria without interference from Russia. Russia kind of lurks the other way, closes its eyes, and the Israeli Air Force could fly whatever it needs to. But we also could recognize that Russia is in a way a bit of a paper tiger, and Russia's capabilities to interfere with Israel defending its national interests are probably pretty limited. So I think Israel is sacrificing principles and ethics, and frankly suppressing the will of the Israeli population, which also overwhelmingly supports Ukraine, in spite of some baggage with the state of Ukraine, for misplaced notions around national security. So they're arresting, the transfer they're arresting the transfer of Iron Dome and other capabilities that would be very, very helpful in this war.
Nemo wants to know this: what is the likelihood of NATO actually acting if a member state is attacked by Putin?
I think it's quite high. There was a lot of speculation about that before this war started. Would the U.S. or the Western NATO come to the aid of, let's say, the Baltics or something of that nature, Macedonia, tiny state, and the Balkans? And to me, it seems clear. That's part of the reason that we have had thousands and thousands of troops flow into Eastern Europe, to warn off Russia from attacking these locations, warn off Russia from having any aspirations to move towards NATO. So I think the answer is yes, that the U.S. and NATO would come to the aid of constituent states. But I also have to make it absolutely clear that if at one point Russia had some aspirations, and I don't think it did, NATO Article 5 provides a high threshold. If in fact they did, they don't have the wherewithal to attack NATO now. They are having a hard enough time in in Ukraine right now to try to fight like a much more powerful adversary in the form of NATO. It's quite possible that they will lose even this much more limited campaign in the East. They have not had, in the 3 years of this 3 days of this campaign as it's unfolded thus far, when you would have expected Russia to achieve some penetration and break through Ukrainian lines, they've not been successful. They haven't taken Mariupol yet. I fear that it's about to fall. It could maybe hold out for another week or so, tying down Russian forces, a lot of Russian forces in that region. But I think the problem is that they just don't have what they need. It's a massive country. They've lost a third of their military that they put into this war thus far. I think an attack on NATO is kind of a pretty far-fetched notion in the short term.
Ivy asks, what are your thoughts about the infamous Azov battalion?
It's interesting. I think the Azov battalion, it started to develop much like a lot of the other atrocities against the Jewish population, geared to rally nationalism around Ukrainian national identity. So even the pogroms and the attacks on the Jewish population in World War II emerged out of a effort to carve out a Ukrainian identity. And this was a particularly effective fighting force, a nationalist, ultra-nationalist fighting force that is very, very effective, has pretty well-trained soldiers, well-resourced to conduct this war for Ukrainian independence. What's you could call it tragic or not, we should recognize is that the Azov battalion is likely to be wiped out in the coming weeks. So they've been fighting to defend that population in Mariupol, defend the nation of Ukraine. and they're on the cusp of being wiped out. But people focus on the Azov battalion, which is a little bit strange, because we all have our whatever our groups are called here in the U.S. Whether it's the KKK, these Oath Keepers, and all sorts of other folks. This is extremism is an issue in a lot of places. It's a huge issue in Russia, frankly. Russia has enormous numbers of extremists, whether it's the Night Wolves or other fringe groups. But for some reason, the Azov battalion, partially because the Russians have been very, very effective at pointing at the Azov battalion and propagandizing the Azov battalion, has disproportionately received a lot of attention, when really the country of Ukraine has been pretty darn good to has reconciled. If there was a break with the Jewish population, they've reconciled, and I frankly give the Ukrainian population enormous credit for saving democracy and saving the Western liberal order for us all. That we should not underestimate or underappraise the service that the Ukrainian people have provided to the world by preserving the Western liberal order. That is a heroic feat that more than makes up for, I think, some limited fringe groups that continue to exist in Ukraine.
Very quickly to this one, if you will, because I want to ask you finally the question we like to always ask on this program, and that is there anything you can be optimistic about? Both Esther and one other person wanted to know about the situation with regard to NATO and Sweden and Norway. And then the other part of the issue was with regard to NATO. What do you say to people who think that Putin was actually declaring war or conducting war because of NATO expansion?
Yeah, that doesn't hold a lot of water for me, because to me it's clear that the last time there was any NATO movement towards Russia was 15 years ago. It's a good good distraction as to why this war is unfolding, but it doesn't explain the why now. The only thing that explains the why now is the fact that that Ukraine continues to unwind from Russian control. Ukraine continues to make great strides in undoing corruption, in integrating with the West. That's what explains why this war is occurring now, not some far-fetched notion of NATO expansion. Again, that the last time we saw any movement towards Russia was 15 years ago.
Can you be uplifting? Can you think of something about this situation that is positive?
Yes, of course. I think that we see the strength of democracy. We see the strength of people, of freedom-loving people, fighting for their homes, fighting for their values, fighting to remain free, overcome enormous odds. And we could have ended up in a situation where, again, the authoritarian world, there's this narrative of the authoritarian world surging, and the kind of the rollback of democracy. And I think this war and Ukraine's ultimate victory, because it's going to win. It's going to win by the fact that it's going to exit this war as a sovereign, independent state. The boundaries are unclear. Kind of depends on how those battles unfold over the next weeks and months. But it's going to exit. Russia just cannot seize the whole thing. And because of this war, I think it's authoritarianism that it's on its heels, and that the prosperity that the U.S. has enjoyed, the Western liberal order that the U.S. has prospered from, is something that will be preserved and buys a little bit more time for us to get our own house in order in the U.S.
Well, Colonel Vindman, thank you so very much for being so candid and so responsive to the questions that I asked and that the audience asked as well. It has been a real privilege to talk with you, and thank you so very much for being on. I wanted to just notify the audience, as David already said, Neil Katyal is the guest next week, and Madeline Brand will be the interlocutor at that point. And thank you very much for watching, and have a good night.